London in 1888 was the most powerful city on earth, capital of an empire, center of trade, culture, and industry. And in that same city, in a neighborhood a few miles from its grandest buildings, 5 women were killed in a span of 10 weeks, and the case was never solved. Not because the city couldn't find the answer, but because it took a long time to ask the right question. London in the late 19th century was the largest city on earth. While the wealthy districts of the West End hosted ballrooms and private clubs and gentlemen reading morning newspapers a few miles east, in the crowded streets of Whitechapel, something very different was unfolding. Whitechapel was one of the most densely populated urban areas in Europe. Thousands of people, many of them recent migrants, working people, families with nowhere else to go, lived packed into crumbling lodging houses and into rookeries. The overcrowded, decaying tenement courts of the Victorian city, and narrow passages where sunlight barely reached the ground. There was chronic unemployment, irregular work, and hunger, not as a figure of speech but as a daily reality. Women who could not afford the price of a bed for the night, a few pennies in many cases, would spend those hours walking the streets instead. The city knew this was happening, and for the most part it looked away. In the autumn of 1888, 5 women were killed. 5 women who had names, who had histories, who had children and families and years behind them. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Between the end of August and early November of that year, all 5 were killed in the streets and alleyways of Whitechapel. This video will not detail the violence done to them. That is a deliberate choice. Not because the history should be erased, but because for over a century those details have been repeated, cataloged, and sensationalized in ways that reduce these 5 women to the circumstances of their deaths rather than the fullness of their lives. What can be said is this: the killings were brutal, they were concentrated in a small area, and they went unsolved. The killer or killers were never identified with certainty. That uncertainty is where the mythology began. Scotland Yard launched what was, for its time, a significant investigation. Hundreds of interviews were conducted, suspects were pursued, evidence was examined. But the investigation faced serious structural problems. The Metropolitan Police had limited forensic tools by modern standards. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Jurisdictional divisions between different police forces in the area sometimes caused coordination failures. And the sheer density of Whitechapel, its lodging houses, its transient population, its labyrinthine courts and alleys, made systematic inquiry enormously difficult. There was also, historians of the period have argued, a layer of class assumption that shaped how the case was understood. The women who were killed lived on the margins of Victorian society. There is evidence that in some quarters their lives were not considered to carry the same weight as those of more respectable citizens. This is a difficult truth about the investigation. It does not mean every officer acted without care. Many clearly did not. But the social framework within which the investigation operated, and within which public sympathy was extended or withheld, was shaped by the hierarchies of its time. And then, in the final days of September, something arrived that would change the shape of this story entirely. In late September 1888, as the investigation was already under enormous public pressure, a letter arrived at a news agency in London. It was signed in a mocking tone, with a name that would become one of the most recognized in criminal history. Many historians and criminologists have argued that the letter was a fabrication. possibly composed by someone seeking to feed the growing public frenzy, perhaps connected to the press itself. The question has never been definitively resolved and remains a matter of scholarly debate to this day. But it did not matter. The name was printed. It spread through the newspapers. It entered the public imagination. And from that moment, the story stopped being primarily about 5 women in Whitechapel. It became about a figure, a monster, a mystery. The press in Victorian London had recently undergone a transformation. New printing technologies meant newspapers could be produced quickly and cheaply. Competition between publications was intense. Circulation meant survival. And the Whitechapel murders, violent, unsolved, set against the backdrop of London's most desperate neighborhood, were exactly the kind of story that sold papers. The coverage was extensive. Sometimes it was graphic. Often it was speculative. Theories circulated freely. Suspects were named. Some of them ordinary people whose lives were damaged or destroyed by the association. The police were criticized. Officials were mocked. The investigation was treated almost as public entertainment. This is not an unusual story, historically speaking. But in 1888 in London, with these particular killings, something crystallized. A narrative template was born. The faceless genius of evil. The fog-wrapped city, the detective who cannot quite catch him. That would shape fiction, film, and true crime storytelling for the next 130 years. The city created the legend as much as any individual crime. In the decades that followed, this media frenzy evolved into a permanent obsession. Decades passed, yet the search for the killer only multiplied, drawing in dozens of new suspects, from laborers and tradesmen to figures in the highest reaches of Victorian society. Without a single piece of definitive proof, none has ever been proven. The field of amateur investigation into the case even acquired its own informal name, ripperology. It is today a genuine subculture, with researchers, conferences, walking tours, and an enormous body of literature. Some of that work is serious historical scholarship. Researchers have spent years reconstructing the lives of the victims, recovering their voices from census records, newspaper reports, and court documents. This kind of work is valuable. It restores some of what sensationalism took away. But there is also a strand of this obsession that has long made historians and ethicists uncomfortable: the tendency to treat the case as an intellectual puzzle, where the victims become almost incidental to the pleasure of the mystery. This tension between genuine inquiry and exploitation is part of what makes the case worth thinking about carefully, rather than simply retelling. Walk through Whitechapel today, and you will find a neighborhood that has changed enormously. It is more diverse, more architecturally layered, more commercially active than it was in 1888. The worst of the poverty that defined the area in the Victorian era has been replaced by different challenges, different communities, different lives. But the geography still carries traces: certain streets, certain alley configurations, a church whose foundation stone predates the entire era, a pub that stood then and stands now. Walking tours of the area attract visitors from around the world. Curious people who want to understand something about the city's hidden memory. And that curiosity, when it is approached honestly, is not wrong. The autumn of 1888 was a genuine turning point in how London, and perhaps Western cities more broadly, thought about crime, about the press, about the relationship between poverty and violence, about what a city owes to its most vulnerable residents. The case raised questions that had no clean answers then, and do not have clean answers now. Who was responsible for the killings? More than 130 years later, no one knows with certainty. Periodically, a new book or documentary emerges claiming to have solved the case, based on a newly discovered letter, a DNA analysis, a reinterpreted piece of evidence. Each time the claim is examined, each time the conclusion among serious researchers is inconclusive. Not every mystery has an answer. Not every investigation ends with a name. The historical record for this case is fragmentary, shaped by the pressures of its time, and contaminated in places by exactly the kind of sensationalism that surrounded it from the beginning. What remains are the facts. 5 women, 5 crimes, an investigation, a city in crisis, and a press machine that turned it all into mythology before the year was even out. There is a kind of storytelling that treats unsolved cases as failures, as incomplete stories waiting to be finished. But perhaps the more honest approach is to hold the incompleteness carefully. To say, we do not know. To say what we can recover is not the killer's identity, but the texture of the city in that season. The streets, the pressures, the people, the conditions that shaped a neighborhood like Whitechapel. To say, the 5 women who were killed deserve to be more than footnotes in someone else's mystery. Mary Ann Nichols was 43 years old. Annie Chapman was 47. Elizabeth Stride was 44. Catherine Eddowes was 46. Mary Jane Kelly was approximately 25. They were real people in a real place in a city that did not always see them clearly. That is the story that still deserves to be told. London in 1888 was not unique in its cruelties. Cities across Europe and North America contained the same compressed inequality, the same invisible populations, the same gap between celebrated progress and the human cost it quietly carried alongside it. But the Whitechapel case, partly because of the press, partly because of the timing, partly because of the mystery that was never resolved, became a mirror. A mirror in which a city and a society could see something of itself it might have preferred not to. That mirror has never been put away. It sits in crime fiction, in detective stories, in journalism, in the language we still use to describe anonymous evil, and in Whitechapel itself, in the streets that have been paved over and renamed, but not entirely forgotten. If you are drawn to the hidden histories of cities, the stories beneath the streets, the people forgotten in the margins of official records, the questions that never got clean answers, there are more of them here to explore. Cities carry more than architecture and tourism and famous names. They carry memory. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones a city would rather not repeat. If that kind of storytelling speaks to you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. There are more cities, more hidden histories, and more of these quiet, unresolved corners of the world still to walk through.